They wore crowns and ruled nations. Their word was immutable law, and their armies shook the foundations of the world. But what happened when these powerful women, these warrior queens and rulers of ancient kingdoms, fell into the iron hands of Rome? A fate awaited them, conceived with chilling calculation, a fate more terrible than a swift and merciful death on the battlefield, more terrible than any nightmare they had ever known. The Roman Empire did not simply defeat its enemies. It transformed their defeat into a grandiose, terrifying spectacle in which former monarchs became living monuments to imperial might and eternal shame. And for women born to rule, this fall meant an encounter with a cruelty designed not to punish, but to erase the very essence of human dignity, to expunge from the memory of nations even the shadow of their former greatness. When the legions of Emperor Aurelian crushed the army of Queen Zenobia near Antioch in 272, her generals and advisors prepared for their inevitable execution. Instead, they witnessed something far more sophisticated, watching as their warrior queen, who had challenged Rome itself, embarked on a path of humiliation honed to icy perfection over centuries of conquest. What drove the Romans to destroy not just the life, but the very soul, pride, and legacy of vanquished queens with such methodical, almost scientific cruelty? The answer lies in the very heart of the Roman worldview, in the cold pragmatism of their laws, and in the insatiable primal thirst for spectacle that moved millions of citizens of the eternal city. Under Roman law, a prisoner of war ceased to be a person. They became a thing, an object, in Latin, res. This fundamental principle, known as the law of nations or ius gentium, with a single stroke of the pen, turned free people, regardless of their origin, into the movable property of the victor. As soon as a city fell or an army surrendered, its inhabitants, from the king to the last slave, legally became the property of the Roman state or the general personally. A queen, in the eyes of this ruthless law, had no more rights than the last soldier of her defeated army or a peasant from her fields. Her titles, her divine origin, her power, all of it turned to dust. This legal system created a frightening, almost surreal reality. Roman citizens, especially during the late Republic and early Empire, possessed a whole set of rights that protected them from the most humiliating punishments. The famous phrase, civis Romanus sum, I am a Roman citizen, was not just words, but a shield capable of staying the hand of an executioner. To have a Roman citizen flogged with whips was considered an unheard-of scandal, capable of destroying the career of any magistrate. To execute him without a trial, without the right to appeal to the people, could provoke public outrage or even a revolt. The Porcian laws, passed as early as the 2nd century BC, expressly forbade corporal punishment for citizens. But for foreign captives, even for those in whose veins flowed royal blood, no such shields existed. Their legal status was nil, their human value equated to their price on the slave market. They could be tortured, displayed for the amusement of a roaring crowd, sold at a slave market in any part of the empire, or deprived of life at the slightest discretion of their captor. Roman law, so meticulous concerning its own, made absolutely no exceptions for either nobility or gender when it came to enemies. A woman who yesterday sat on a throne could today be sold to a brothel or sent to hard labor in the mines. As early as the laws of the 12 Tables, the most ancient code of Roman law from the 5th century BC, these principles were laid out with ruthless and laconic clarity. Prisoners captured in war became the property of the Roman people, and were distributed by quaestors either as state slaves or among the soldiers as personal spoils. Women of royal lineage discovered with horror that their former power meant absolutely nothing Once cold iron chains replaced the golden diadems on their heads. The great historian Tacitus, whose works are imbued with a stoic contempt for tyranny, documented this legal reality with blood-chilling precision, describing the treatment of the vanquished British nobility. He noted that Roman officials, intoxicated by power and impunity, without the slightest hesitation, subjected to violence and humiliation those who just yesterday had commanded armies, administered justice, and were considered descendants of the gods. For them, this was not a crime, but the exercise of the victor's right. For female captives, especially those from the elite, there existed an additional, particular vulnerability, rooted deeply in Rome's patriarchal military culture. The Roman army, forged in centuries of continuous conquests on 3 continents, viewed captured women as a legitimate and expected part of the spoils of war, as a trophy confirming a soldier's valor. Although some elite captives might be held in relative comfort pending ransom or complex political negotiations, the majority faced immediate and brutal humiliation. The line between a prisoner of war of royal blood and a common slave was, in practice, completely illusory, especially in the first chaotic hours and days after a defeat. Defeat dissolved any former status, leaving captive queens completely defenseless against treatment that would have been unthinkable had they possessed even the most basic Roman citizenship. Their bodies, their will, their future, all of it passed into the complete and undivided disposal of the victor, be it a simple legionary or the emperor himself. The Roman triumph was not just a victory parade. It was the apotheosis of imperial power, a sacred theatrical ritual that transformed military success into a public spectacle of universal scale, and captive monarchs were its main, most valuable adornment. When the Senate granted a triumphant general permission for this highest manifestation of honor, a grand, months-long preparation began for the procession that was to carry the glory of Rome through the streets of the Eternal City, cementing it in the consciousness of every inhabitant. The route stretched for almost 4 kilometers, from the Campus Martius outside the sacred boundaries of the city, through the Triumphal Gate past circuses and theaters, through the Sacred Forum, and to the Capitoline Hill, past hundreds of thousands of jubilant citizens drunk with pride and wine. These processions followed a meticulously planned scenario, calculated for maximum psychological and propagandistic effect. At the head walked senators and magistrates, followed by trumpeters whose fanfares resounded over the city, announcing the greatness of Rome. Then came enormous wagons with captured treasures, mountains of gold, silver, precious armor, and works of art. On giant platforms, they carried paintings and 3-dimensional models of conquered cities, depicting the most dramatic moments of the campaign: sieges, battles, surrenders. Wild exotic animals brought from the conquered provinces were led in chains: elephants from Africa, lions from Numidia, leopards from Asia, giving the Romans a glimpse into the unknown world their legions had subdued. And then, at the very heart of this spectacle, after all the riches and curiosities, came they, the prisoners of war, bound in shackles. And at the head of this sorrowful column of captives, like the crown jewel of the entire collection, walked the captured rulers, kings and queens. Often, they were intentionally left in their royal garments, their purple mantles and diadems, to emphasize the full depth of their fall, the stark contrast between past glory and present disgrace. Women who had recently commanded armies and received ambassadors now trudged through the dust, their chains clanking under a hail of jeers, spittle, and catcalls from the crowd. This contrast was deliberate and diabolically cruel. By parading monarchs in their full regalia, yet shackled, filthy, and helpless, Rome sent an unambiguous, soul-chilling signal that resonated far beyond the city walls, reaching the ears of Parthian kings and Germanic chieftains. No kingdom was beyond reach. No throne guaranteed safety from the all-consuming power of Rome. It was a message carved not in stone, but in the humiliation of living people. The triumphal procession served several purposes simultaneously. It demonstrated Rome's military might to potential allies and future enemies, showing the futility of resistance. It satisfied the thirst for spectacle and blood of the Roman citizens, the plebs, who demanded visible proof of victory and their right to rule the world. And most importantly, it provided an official, state-sanctioned stage for the systematic public humiliation of those who dared to challenge Roman expansion. For the captive queens, the triumph meant hours of agonizing marching under thousands of curious and hostile gazes, completely stripped of their former dignity, transformed from a subject of history into its pathetic object. The route usually took an entire day, from dawn until dusk. The procession moved agonizingly slowly so that the spectators along the entire route, who filled the streets, rooftops, and temple steps, could scrutinize every detail, every tear on the cheek of the vanquished foe, every frightened glance. The captive queens endured this hell on earth, knowing that their fate hung by a thread. Some of them would survive the day to live out their old age in honorable exile. Others would not see the sunset, their journey ending at the foot of the Capitoline Hill. This very uncertainty was a sophisticated form of psychological torture, forcing the vanquished, with every step along streets strewn with flowers in honor of their own disgrace, to contemplate their imminent doom. Queen Zenobia of Palmyra was not just a rebel or a minor ruler on the fringe of the empire. She was the architect of her own empire, which stretched from Egypt to Anatolia, issuing a direct and audacious challenge to Rome's authority throughout the wealthiest East. Her capital, Palmyra, an oasis city in the middle of the Syrian desert, was one of the richest centers of the world at that time, a crossroads of caravan routes where the silks of China, the spices of India, and the incense of Arabia converged. When her husband, King Odenathus, a loyal ally of Rome, was treacherously assassinated, Zenobia, acting as regent for her young son Vaballathus, did not just hold on to power. She began a swift expansion. She seized Egypt, the breadbasket of Rome, and proclaimed herself and her son Augusti, effectively declaring the creation of an independent Palmyrene empire. For Rome, torn apart by the internal turmoil of the crisis of the 3rd century, this was a stab in the back. When the soldier Emperor Aurelian, having restored order in the West, finally turned his gaze to the East, he gained something more than just a military victory. After defeating her forces in the battles of Imai and Emesa and a desperate siege of Palmyra itself, he captured the queen as she was trying to flee to Persia for aid. In her, he acquired the perfect symbol for his upcoming triumph, a living embodiment of the conquered, fabulously wealthy, and arrogant East. The Historia Augusta, a collection of imperial biographies written in the 4th century, provides us with a strikingly detailed, almost cinematic description of Zenobia's appearance in Aurelian's grand triumphal procession in 274 AD. This account, likely based on lost works by contemporaries and eyewitness testimonies, paints a picture of a spectacle designed to stun, humiliate, and horrify. Zenobia was literally laden with precious gems, which sparkled and shimmered in the rays of the Italian sun, turning her into a walking treasury, a glittering monument to Rome's power over the world's richest kingdoms. Her dress was embroidered with pearls, and bracelets glittered on her arms and legs. But it was the chains that drew everyone's attention and remained in the memory of generations. These were not simple iron shackles, intended merely to restrain a prisoner. Zenobia walked, bound by the heaviest chains of pure gold. They were so massive and heavy that, according to historians, a special attendant, a Persian jester or slave, walked beside her, helping to carry their weight so that the queen would not collapse under the burden of her own humiliation. The choice of gold was a brilliant and diabolical propaganda move. These chains symbolized the very wealth she once possessed and so prided herself on, now transformed into an instrument of her enslavement. Her entire figure became a living allegory, the luxury of the East, now serving the shame of the East. Ancient sources, even those hostile to her, note that throughout this hours-long ordeal, Zenobia maintained an astonishing, almost superhuman composure. Despite the unbearable weight of the golden chains, which according to some accounts were even fastened to her neck with a golden collar, and the hours of slow progress through the hostile, roaring, spitting crowd, she carried herself with unbroken royal dignity. She did not weep, nor did she beg for mercy. She must have drawn strength from her pride, understanding that her only remaining weapon was contempt for her tormentors. Perhaps it was this unbroken majesty that saved her life. Aurelian, a harsh man, but not without pragmatism, was probably impressed by her composure. Or perhaps he coolly calculated that her continued existence as an honored captive would serve his purposes better than her swift and glorious martyrdom. At the end of the triumphal procession, when other leaders, such as the Germanic ones, were led away to their execution, Zenobia was spared. Instead of a death sentence, the emperor granted her a luxurious villa in Tiber, modern-day Tivoli, near Rome, where she lived out the rest of her days in comfort and security. Some sources claim that she married an influential Roman senator and became the ancestress of a noble Roman family, and her daughters married into the highest aristocracy. Whether this was an act of mercy or simply a more subtle, prolonged form of humiliation remains a matter of debate. Zenobia spent her final decades as a living reminder of Rome's omnipotence. Her presence in the very heart of Italian society was a constant, silent demonstration that even the most powerful queens could be reduced to the position of a beautiful plaything, entirely dependent on the emperor's mercy. In the year 60 AD, at the other end of the empire, in the foggy and recently conquered land of Britain, a different, far bloodier drama was unfolding. When Prasutagus, king of the Celtic Iceni tribe, died, he left behind a will that he believed was the height of diplomatic wisdom and would protect his kingdom and family. He was a client king of Rome, a ruler who retained nominal independence in exchange for loyalty. Hoping to preserve this fragile peace, he bequeathed half of his vast kingdom and immense wealth to the Roman Emperor Nero, and the other half to his two daughters under the guardianship of their mother, Queen Boudica. This strategy was a desperate attempt to appease Roman greed while preserving at least a shadow of independence for his people. But it failed with catastrophic, unimaginable consequences. The Roman officials on the ground, led by the imperial procurator Decianus Catus, a greedy and short-sighted man, completely ignored the late king's will. They declared all the lands, herds, and property of the Iceni to be the property of Rome, as if Prasutagus had been not an ally but a defeated enemy, and his kingdom was war booty. Roman centurions and tax collectors began to plunder the lands of the Iceni, treating the tribe's nobility like slaves. When his widow, Queen Boudica, a proud and imperious woman, dared to protest this blatant violation of the treaty and of Roman law itself, she faced a punishment that clearly demonstrated how little royal status meant in the face of the Roman war machine on the fringes of the empire. The historian Tacitus, whose father-in-law, the famous general Gnaeus Julius Agricola, was serving in Britain at that very time and was an eyewitness to the events, described what followed with a directness and sympathy unusual for ancient authors. Boudica, a queen and the widow of a monarch allied with Rome, was publicly, in front of her subjects, tied to a post and flogged with whips, like the lowliest delinquent slave. This alone was an unheard-of insult and the deepest humiliation. A flogging for a Roman citizen was a serious crime. A flogging for the queen of an allied kingdom was an act of deliberate violation of all norms, a demonstration of complete contempt and the establishment of a new order of things. But the Romans did not stop there. Boudica's daughters, young girls and heirs to the throne, were given over to be raped by Roman soldiers before the eyes of their beaten mother and humiliated tribesmen. Tacitus describes these atrocities in sparse but horror-filled language. He emphasizes that the queen was flogged and her daughters were dishonored, placing these two crimes at the very center of his explanation for the incredibly bloody rebellion that followed. This was not the random violence of drunken soldiers in the heat of battle. It was a calculated, systematic public humiliation designed to break the will of the royal family and demonstrate Rome's absolute animalistic dominance over the Iceni. The public nature of these crimes amplified their effect manyfold. This was violence committed not in secret, but as a public execution of honor, a spectacle intended to terrorize an entire tribe into permanent submission. However, this brutal strategy had a completely opposite, explosive result. Instead of crushing the resistance, the violation of the royal family ignited a flame of rebellion with such fury that it nearly threw the Romans out of Britain for good. Boudica, transformed from a grieving widow into a fury of vengeance, a living embodiment of her people's defiled honor, raised an army, uniting the Iceni and the neighboring Trinovantes tribe. Her warriors, driven by a thirst for revenge, wiped 3 major Roman cities from the face of the earth: Camulodunum, modern Colchester, the provincial capital and a symbol of Roman rule, the prosperous trading center of Londinium, London, and Verulamium, St. Albans. Tens of thousands of Roman citizens and their allies were mercilessly slaughtered. Tacitus and Cassius Dio describe scenes of unimaginable cruelty on the part of the rebels, who paid the Romans back in their own coin, sparing neither women nor children. The rebellion ended in a crushing defeat on a battlefield unknown to us, which has gone down in history as the Battle of Watling Street. The iron discipline, tactical superiority, and experience of the Roman legions under the command of Gaius Suetonius Paulinus overcame the vastly numerically superior but poorly organized Briton forces, who were encumbered by a huge baggage train. Tacitus reports that Boudica, unwilling to be taken captive and foreseeing the fate that awaited her, took poison, preferring death to further humiliation. The fate of her daughters remains unknown. They disappear from the pages of history after that first terrible act of violence, their personal tragedies dissolving into the silence of the ages, remaining only as the horrific catalyst for one of the most brutal rebellions in the history of the Roman Empire. But there was a third road, a third path for a captive queen, a path that allowed one to avoid both the honorable exile of Zenobia and the fiery retribution of Boudica. This path was chosen by the most famous of all, Cleopatra VII, the last queen of Hellenistic Egypt. After the crushing defeat of her and Mark Antony's fleet at the Battle of Actium in 31 BC, she found herself trapped in her capital, Alexandria, awaiting the arrival of the victor, Octavian, the future Emperor Augustus. She knew what awaited her. She was the final and most coveted trophy, one that would conclude the civil wars and establish Octavian's sole power. Octavian, a cold-blooded and calculating politician, desired more than anything in the world to parade Cleopatra in chains at his triumph in Rome. This would have been the crown of his victory, the final humiliation of the Ptolemaic dynasty, and a symbol of the conquest of the richest country in the Mediterranean. He entered into negotiations with her, giving her false hopes of preserving power for her children, but his true goal was singular: to take her alive. Plutarch describes their meeting. Cleopatra, no longer young but still possessing incredible charm, tried to seduce him as well, just as she had once seduced Caesar and Antony. But Octavian was cut from a different cloth. He looked right through her, seeing only the main exhibit for his future show. Realizing that her fate was sealed and the path of shame through the streets of Rome was inevitable, Cleopatra made a decision that immortalized her and dealt Octavian his most painful defeat. She decided to deprive him of his triumph, snatching the ultimate prize from him. She chose death on her own terms, as a queen, not as a slave. Plutarch left us a dramatic account of her final hours. Dressed in her finest royal robes, she held a final feast. Then, according to the most famous version, an asp, a sacred Egyptian cobra whose bite was believed to lead to the world of the gods, was secretly brought to her in a basket of figs. She allowed the snake to bite her. When Octavian's messengers burst into her mausoleum, they found her dead, lying on a golden couch in full royal regalia, while her two handmaidens were dying at her feet, having managed to adjust the diadem on their mistress's head. Cleopatra had won. She had escaped the chains, the jeers of the crowd, and the final humiliation, turning her death into an act of supreme defiance. Octavian had to parade only her statue in his triumph, which was a poor substitute for the living queen. As the triumphal processions snaked their way through a jubilant Rome toward the Capitoline Hill, the captive male rulers knew that their journey would most likely end at the foot of this sacred rise, at the grim, gaping entrance to the Mamertine prison. This ancient, gruesome structure, known in Latin as the Tullianum, was carved directly into the slope of the Capitoline and served as the final, irreversible stop for Rome's most famous and hated enemies. While the triumphator, in dazzling robes, his face painted red like the statue of Jupiter, slowly ascended the slope to the temple to offer thanksgivings, the condemned prisoners were led aside. They were thrust into the prison to be subjected to a quiet and terrible execution. The Tullianum consisted of 2 levels. The upper chamber served as a regular prison, but it was the lower dungeon, a circular stone pit accessible only through an opening in the floor, that was the true death chamber. Here, in eternal darkness, piercing cold, and a stench that came from its proximity to Rome's main sewer, the Cloaca Maxima, the enemies of Rome met their end. The method of execution was simple and effective. Most often, it was strangulation by a noose, carried out by a special executioner. Others, as a sign of particular contempt, were simply left to die of hunger and thirst. The entire process was deliberately hidden from public view, taking place while the victory celebration continued on the streets above the heads of the dying. Vercingetorix, the great chieftain of the Arverni, who managed to unite the disparate and eternally feuding tribes of Gaul into a single army against Julius Caesar, became a textbook example of such a fate. After his heroic yet tragic defeat at the Battle of Alesia in 52 BC, where he surrendered personally to Caesar, throwing his weapons at his feet, he was not executed immediately. Caesar held him captive for 6 long years, 6 years in a Roman prison, awaiting humiliation. Finally, in 46 BC, he was paraded in chains in one of Caesar's 4 triumphs. The Gallic chieftain, once a mighty and formidable warrior, had turned into a broken, emaciated man during his years of imprisonment. After he walked his final path before the Roman crowd, he was taken to the Tullianum and strangled there. Jugurtha, the cunning and elusive king of Numidia, who had outwitted the Roman armies for many years, met an equally cruel end after the triumph of Gaius Marius in 104 BC. According to ancient authors, when his royal robes and earrings were ripped off with such force that his earlobes were torn, he was thrown into the icy dampness of the lower dungeon. The king, accustomed to the African heat, went mad with terror and cold. He was left to die of starvation. For 6 days he fought for his life in complete darkness until his cries fell silent forever. The historian Plutarch recorded his last words, reportedly said in a delirium of despair, "By Hercules, what a cold bath you have, Romans!" Simon Bar Giora, one of the charismatic and ruthless leaders of the Great Jewish Revolt, which ended with the destruction of Jerusalem and the Temple in 70 AD, was also the main exhibit at the grand joint triumph of the emperors Vespasian and Titus. Josephus, the Jewish historian and an eyewitness to those events, described in detail how the entire triumphal procession stopped at the temple of Jupiter Capitolinus. A dead, tense silence fell. The whole city froze in anticipation. Everyone awaited the messengers with the news that Simon's execution had been carried out at the traditional place in the Forum. And only after confirmation of the chief enemy's death arrived did the ceremonies resume, and joyous shouts and applause spread throughout the city. The sacrifice had been made. The victory was complete. Far from every captured ruler, whether man or woman, was sent to their execution. The decision rested with the triumphator, and during the imperial era with the emperor himself, and it was dictated by pure pragmatism. Some captives, as we saw with the example of Zenobia, proved more valuable alive, serving as a permanent symbol of Roman victory or as a bargaining chip in future diplomatic games. But for those marked for death, for those whose resistance had been too stubborn and Rome's hatred too strong, the triumph was merely the final, most humiliating reprieve before the descent into the darkness and oblivion of the Tullianum. The treatment of captive queens, with all its mercilessness, reveals the true, unseemly nature of power in the ancient world, devoid of romantic flair. The legal systems that so carefully protected their own citizens evaporated at the borders of conquered lands. The dignity inherent in nobility and royal status dissolved in the bitterness of defeat, like sugar in water. Rome did not simply conquer. It systematically erased individuality, turning people born to rule into silent objects for the demonstration of its own limitless power. These documented cases, which have come down to us thanks to Tacitus, Cassius Dio, Plutarch, and other ancient historians, force us to confront the methodical, calculated cruelty embedded in the very foundation of Roman conquests. The flogging of Boudica, the golden chains of Zenobia, Cleopatra's suicide as an act of protest, the executions after triumphs, all these were not random excesses of war, but a cold, calculated state policy, aimed at breaking the will to resist and immortalizing the glory of Rome in the minds of generations. This was terror elevated to the rank of a high state art. The stone walls of the Mamertine prison still stand in the very heart of modern Rome, as a silent and terrible reminder that the brilliant triumphs, celebrated in ancient texts and depicted on the bas-reliefs of arches, were built upon unspeakable human suffering. Queens who administered justice, patronized the arts, and led armies into battle found themselves reduced to the level of a spectacle. Their humiliation turned into entertainment for the crowd, who never considered the price of empire, a price written in broken lives, blood, and the stolen dignity of those who dared to stand in the way of the eternal city.